Hey everyone, welcome to the Rise and Above podcast, a platform for you to share your story. Oftentimes, we all have something that happens to us in life and we have no way of sharing. Many people want an outlet, whether it's writing a book or going on a massive networking platform or starting an inspirational social media account. With the Rise and Above platform, anyone with an inspiring, motivating, or interesting story can come on and share. It could be anything from the struggles of starting a business, the struggles of overcoming homelessness or mental illness. I've interviewed victims of rape, sexual assault, and abuse. There is no subject that is off limits. This platform offers a safe and fun way for you to share your story through a one-on-one experience. If you would like to share your story, the best way to reach out would be through social media. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook or through email. All the links will be provided in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the Rise and Above podcast. My name's David Hess, and today I have Adam Grant with me. He got a hold of me a few weeks back and wanted to come on and share his story. He was also on the Fledges podcast every damn day today. And so I guess with that being said, how are you doing today, Adam?
I'm doing well. I'm tired. It's been an interesting day. As I mentioned in Jerry's podcast, I was also driving a car that had minimal brakes trying to help somebody out. So I guess it's like an amusement ride for the day. So, which I still have to drive down to Jackson tomorrow to get it closer to her. So.
Oh, geez. That'll make it interesting.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. Are you from the Lansing area? You just mentioned that you're going to get married here shortly.
Yes. Yes, I grew up all around the Lansing area. I went to elementary school and stuff in Charlotte, Potterville, Vermontville. In 7th grade, I came to Lansing, started going to Pattongill, went to Lansing Eastern. Like I told Jerry, it's kind of went as a loose term. But I consider this to be home, and this is where my mother lives, where my fiance lives, my mother-in-law, brother-in-law, my brother. So Lansing's my home.
That's awesome. I also kind of grew up in Charlotte, so.
My condolences.
So you've been out of prison for a year and a half, right?
Yes.
You want to take me back and tell me what happened? Tell the audience, I guess, rather.
What sent me to prison?
Let's just talk about whatever. Let's kind of take it back to what you were involved in. And
I was involved in a little bit of everything. I started. My first robbery was at 12 of a Zephyr gas station. I got in trouble. My first formal trouble, because my dad helped get me out of trouble the first time. My first formal trouble was I broke into Charlotte High School in 1985, tripping on acid, and not the best experience in the world. And one of my rappies was not the smartest guy. He wrote him and his girlfriend's name on the girls' bathroom wall, so it was pretty easy to find us. But that just didn't. It didn't stop because I was kind of invested in being a bad guy. It was a little bit easier to be a bad guy than it was to be a good guy. I was constantly told about this potential that I had, but it was always a backhanded comment because it always meant you weren't living up to it. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really want to have potential, and I didn't want people to keep talking about it. So I just kept doing stupid things.
What was your home life like?
My home life was typical of a lot of people's, other than the fact that I guess my mother was 15 when she had me. Okay. So she was learning everything. I mean, there's a running joke in our family, but it's true that not only didn't she have her driver's license when I was born, she didn't know how to ride a bike.
Oh my God.
She learned how to ride a bike with me on the back of one. And if you know what a baby seat in 1970 looks like, it's like a seat belt with a saltine box. It was not the safest thing in the world. But I had two other sisters. One was born 5 years after I was. One was born 6 years after I was. So I was the big brother. My mom was married and divorced twice by the time I was 8. So that also puts you kind of where you feel you're the man of the house. Mm-hmm. You don't even know what that means, but
right.
You kind of figure that's what it is. But I mean, I had a good life in a lot of ways that I knew I was loved, and I knew I was like my sisters looked up to me, and it felt good, but it also felt like a responsibility. We were poor. I mean, we grew up on welfare. We grew up on food stamps. I can't remember what all the colors stood for, but I knew which ones to grab at which time back in the day. Grew up on commodities, and I mean, we struggled like a lot of other people did, but I also don't want to minimize the fact that I know my mom tried hard. I know she loved me, and it couldn't be easy raising me. So I give her a lot of credit.
So you were kind of running with the wrong crowds in high school. Where did that lead?
Everywhere but the right places. I was a bit of a chameleon in high school too, that I could travel in almost any circles, and you couldn't tell what I was going to wear from one day to the next. And it kind of showed that I traveled in different circles. I was a jock, so I played sports when I wasn't in trouble, and I could actually involve myself in them. I was also a burnout. I was also, when I applied myself, I did well in school, and I didn't, and it wasn't that difficult for me. There were many times I had to retake a test because my teachers swore there was no way that I couldn't have not cheated because I'd slept through all the classes. There's no way, there's no way you could have got that grade on there.
Right.
So it wasn't so much that I even ran in the wrong circles. I gravitated more to the wrong circles because being a successful failure is a lot easier than being a failing success.
Do you think that you were just trying to find who you were as a person, so you were just kind of bouncing around to all these different groups? Or did you find that you associated better with the people who were burnouts or?
I think I did. I don't know if I was really even trying to find myself. I think I already thought I knew who I was.
Mm-hmm.
If you know anything like about Native tradition and stuff, and the most obvious example of this is the Hioka of the Lakota. I almost thought that I was some kind of a Hioka, which is a clown who does everything backwards. And like, if this person in your village is doing this,
Mm-hmm.
nobody else should. And somehow I believed that that's who I was, as some kind of a Hioka, that I was never gonna, get things right. So I didn't put a lot of energy into it. And every time I would, you could see this in my high school record, that at the beginning of the year I would always do well, and I'm doing 2-a-days for football, and I'm getting good grades, and one thing would happen,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'd be off the tracks. And the reason I'd be off the tracks is because I always thought when I was doing well, that was me faking it. And when I was doing bad, that was the real me, which is an interesting thing to realize much later in life. But that was the logic that I had going, and that was the governing logic that.
So you would sabotage yourself.
Oh, without a doubt. I stole my mother's car on Christmas Eve, man. I mean, full blown Grinch. It's ridiculous, but I did, and things were going well. And those were my triggers. When things would go well, I would
skeptical.
sabotage them. Exactly.
Things are too good. I can't stay this way.
No, I'm gonna screw it up at some point. Let me screw it up on my terms right now. And I did that on a regular basis. And it cost me a lot of relationships later on because of the fact that people knew that. It cost me a good relationship with myself because it took me a long time to realize I wasn't fooling myself anymore. And so doing 27 years in prison, that was part of the journey. People are like, well, nope, people don't usually get that amount of time. I needed it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have learned at 10. I might not have learned at 15. I don't think I needed all 27 of them, 20, 25, but they serve their purpose.
Now, what led you to going into prison?
Well, I mean, drugs and bad behavior, and I've spent 31 and a half years in some form of incarceration.
Wow.
So I went to jail at 17 for B&E and carrying a concealed weapon. I don't want to start any beefs in 2021, but if anybody remembers the Nutty Boys back in the day, there was a little bit of...
You know them?
heard of it.
Yeah, there was a little bit of they were making a name and they were running around and they were jumping on certain people and they jumped on a few of my friends and they were
Wow.
like, Dino's next. And I was Dino, and so I drank 3 quarts of Mezcal and did an 8 ball of Coke and went out looking for them.
Oh, man.
But thankfully, I didn't find them. So that's where I caught the B&E and the carrying a concealed weapon. Did a year in a county jail on that one. Got out. Never really did probation or parole very well. So I caught another case after that. Went to prison at 19. Did 2 years in prison. Came home. Didn't want to go back, but didn't have the resilience or stamina to be able to live life on life's terms. And so, a few things kind of pushed me in the wrong direction. And I ran again and stole a checkbook from my step grandparents. And that fueled a run of, drugs and alcohol. And it ended up with me robbing a bank in Vermontville.
Wow.
So that's what I went for 27 years for, was bank robbery, bank and or safe robbery as the...
Did you get away with it?
I mean, what's get away? I got 3 days. I got to party a little bit on it.
You
I only
got
had $200 and some left in my pocket when they caught me, so I guess I got away.
That's insane. How much money did you get away with?
There were 3 of us, and there was only about $5,000, so it was
Wow.
about $1,700 a piece or something like that.
Wow. Totally not worth it, right?
No, especially when you figure out 27 years divided by that, and if I would have made minimum wage for that entire period, it was a nice chunk of money. So.
Oh my gosh. So, what was it like going to prison? What was your experience like in prison?
The first time was a little bit different because I didn't know. And I was 19 and I joked that you can't tell it now, but I was fine back then. And being fine in prison is not a good thing. It was pretty rough. I managed. I spent a lot of time in the hole in my first incarceration. So like when I said, when I came home, I did not want to go back to prison. But I also learned that I could survive it. And that's what I've done a lot of times. And so when the stuff hit the fan, that I wasn't really worried about whether or not I went back to prison. I figured, again, Hyoka, I thought I was always going to do the wrong thing anyway.
Right.
So I was going to end up back in prison eventually. I might as well have a good run before it happened. The second time was a little bit different because in Michigan you have indeterminate sentencing. Indeterminate sentencing means that people hear all the time, you got sentenced to this amount of time. You get sentenced to this amount of time at a minimum and this amount of time at a max.
Right.
So remember, I'm 22 years old when I commit this bank robbery. It's 1993. They tell me that my first out date minus disciplinary credits is 2022. My entire lifetime into the next century, and I still have 7 years before I even get there. And my max date's 2045.
Wow.
So reality kind of set in, and I remember having a moment of clarity in quarantine. I got my pink sheet. My pink sheet is when you get all those numbers in front of you. You got 5 different out dates. And I remember having a moment of clarity, like, now you've got some choices to make. And I laughed out loud because I was like, it would have been nice to know I had choices 5 months ago before all this happened. But I started making decisions. Am I going to impress the people in here, or am I going to start worrying about impressing the people out there that mattered? And that transformed years down the road to not impressing anybody, but becoming impressive. And so I started to work on that. But
What'd you do to work on it?
everything, as they say today, all the things I did. I found a way to get into college while I was in there, and so I started taking correspondence courses. I took the most difficult. I took a 4-credit logic class, which was both informal and formal logic. So I'm doing like Polish notation and truth tables and stuff with nobody to teach me.
What?
I'm doing this correspondence-wise, but I found my way through it, and I was like, if I can do this, I can do anything. They didn't let you take a lot of classes in there when you have the amount of time that I do, because they let you get, the closer you get to your out date, you get to take classes.
Oh, okay.
So I'm so far away from my out date that I'd started learning things so that I could put proposals in to teach the classes and self-help groups.
Wow.
So there was at one point in time when I went back on my appeal, I realized that the amount of classes that I had taught or facilitated, if I would have started all over again, it would have taken me 9.5 years of doing a class every single day to reach that number again.
Wow.
And I started out faking it. So I faked it until I made it. And the more I worked on this stuff, the more it started working on me. And I was like, maybe I have something to offer. Maybe I'm not a clown after all.
I had I can't remember his name now. The guy from Good Time Makes Good Sense. He's an advocate. He works for them.
Okay.
But he was on the podcast, and he was in prison for I think 24 years. And he was saying that in order to be able to take college classes in prison, your family have to pay for it, and it's not cheap. It's equivalent to like going to like MSU or U of M just for like a local community college.
Absolutely. And then you also have all the obstacles of getting your books and things like that. Because out here you can get used books, so you can get them at a discount. Everything in there has to be brand new, and it has to come from certain publishers. So you not only pay a premium, you usually end up paying the premium. So I was paying, I think the average that I was paying, and this was friends, family, and my own. I worked pretty good jobs in there, so I'd make $70, $80 a month, which is pretty good money. But my books would cost about $240 a piece on average, and I was usually paying, like you said, you're paying out-of-district prices.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you might be doing community college or something like that, or
Right.
Ohio University, which is nearly $400 a credit, you're paying a premium. I found a place called California Coast University towards the end of it, and they did a really good program, and it was $150 a credit.
Wow.
So I finished up my associate's degree before I came home, and just before I came home, they restarted the Second Chance Pell Grants, which help a lot of people now.
Have you heard of the Good Time Makes Good Sense?
Absolutely, and it makes excellent sense.
Are you involved with them at all?
Loosely. I have a stack of these too, and so when I go to
Okay.
certain events, I'm doing something for Nation Outside on the 28th down in Jackson. They're doing their Summerfest down there, and I'll be bringing a stack of those cards too to explain that. There's a lot of different ways to approach the good time. We are the worst. And one of the things that I think we even do wrong in the messaging of this is that people were like, you'll hear, well, you do 100% of your minimum in the state of Michigan. Well, most people think, well, that's what you're supposed to do. The actual number is we do 126%.
Can you explain
of our
that? Because
minimum.
a lot of people that I've talked to since I did the podcast, I can't remember his name, with the guy from Good Time Makes Good Sense, they're like, oh, I thought Michigan had something like that. But that's not the case.
No, we used to. We used to have good time. We used to have disciplinary credits. I was down for so long that I literally had disciplinary credits. But then the courts evolved too and get people in it that they weren't around when disciplinary credits and good time were. So my judge was telling me, I don't think you should be getting out early. I'm not getting out early. I earned these things. You earn these things. Different ones are set up different ways. But basically, as long as you're staying out of trouble, as long as you're doing the programming that you're supposed to do, it incentivizes that good behavior,
Right.
and you get an opportunity to get released prior to a calendar minimum. What a lot of people don't know too is the Michigan public got tricked into flat time in this state because they said, well, in order to get federal funds, that you have to do this. Well, what they didn't tell them is that we were already in compliance with the federal standard. We were already doing 85% of our minimum. We had a disciplinary credit situation that would give you 5 days a month, 2 special if you were doing, above and beyond.
Okay.
So yeah, we're under truth in sentencing, and we're one of the most restrictive forms of truth in sentencing in the country.
I know I talked to a family member about this, and he's like, I don't agree with that. He's like, because if somebody injured my family and they ended up going to prison because of it, he's like, I don't think I would want them to get out earlier.
Right.
And my response to that was like, well, eventually they're going to get out. They're going to be walking among the rest of us. So why not incentivize good behavior?
Not only that, but I mean, that's not the way it works. All of these things are baked into the sentence. So when there is good time, they change the way the sentencing, the way the sentencing is,
Right.
because they know it's going to be factored in. but it does exactly incentivize good behavior. Right now, there's no incentive. You're going to go up on your calendar minimum and you're going to get considered at that. And there's nothing to really be looking at as far as behavior wise. Now, don't get me wrong, the parole board looks at your behavior.
Right.
But most people, especially if they're doing a longer sentence, aren't thinking 15 years down the road until they get to 2 or 3 years down the road.
Right.
So the first one is messy. Now, if you've got disciplinary credits to think about and it can cost you more years, you're going to think about it more, and therefore you're going to have a different mindset through the entirety of your sentence as opposed to towards the end of it. And I use this analogy. If you stick a sponge in the bottom of a sink and you start just a slow stream of water coming out, that sponge will soak up pretty much every drop that comes out of that faucet, which is what happens if you do over the course of an entire sentence. They get to absorb the material.
Right.
If you put them in the last 2 years and try and put everything in them, it's like turning the faucet on full blast. Half of it splatters over the side, onto the floor, everything else, and you wasted an opportunity.
That makes sense. Good time makes good sense.
Good time makes a good sense. So does good sponges.
So how did your time in prison prepare you for life on the outside? I mean, because I would imagine going in for 27 years, it would be a drastic change when you came out.
I use this, and people who listen to me are going to get tired of hearing this story, but it's so apropos that my fiance took a picture of me sitting out on the patio with ice water in my hand, my feet kicked up. She said, I want to send it back into JP, a friend of mine in there. She said, I want JP to see the free Adam. JP responded the same day and said, Adam doesn't look any different. He must have been free before he went home. And so my experience of this has been seamless in the sense that I started living like I was free well before I came home, because I think that's extremely important. If you're constantly putting things off, practice makes permanent, it doesn't make perfect. You know, you go out there and run routes on the football field and stuff, not so that you can do them perfectly, but so you create muscle memory so that you know, it's for and an out. You don't even have to think and count about these things anymore. And if you start doing those things in there, when you come out here, I had already developed good habits. So I just had a bigger yard. I just had more opportunities available to me. But I also understand that my circumstances and situation was a little bit different because of COVID too, because the world shrunk and I'd already come from a smaller place. So I was built for this.
Thrive in chaos.
Right. And yeah. Everybody's talking about being locked down and stuff, and I'm like,
this is freedom.
This is not it. I told Katie all the time, my fiance, I said, you're the best bunkie I ever had. Plus I have a refrigerator here and a memory foam mattress and all these things. I'm like, I'm living the life.
That's hilarious. So when you got out of prison, did you find it difficult to find acceptance? Did you find it difficult to find jobs? I mean, you had mentioned COVID. Obviously, I'm sure it's a little easier to find jobs now, but
it is. Well, it is, and it isn't. Because I found a job. I got a job canvassing. I was actually canvassing for the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, and the first week was when COVID jumped off. I was at the Secretary of State when they closed it down.
Wow.
I was on Michigan State's campus when they closed it down, and that Sunday they closed down the entire company that I was working for. I just got promoted to field supervisor.
Oh, wow.
I was really excited, and the world started to close down. So there are more possibilities, but also a lot of things they just are what they are, and there are stigmas associated with people who are incarcerated. The way it's set up is it doesn't matter the fact that my crime was 27 years old. I was still under supervision, so it might as well have happened yesterday.
Right.
So that it's still a current thing. So I joke all the time about that. I was 30 for 30 in interviews. Everybody wanted to hire me, but they didn't have the decisions. The decisions are above them, and so they would make their point, they would make their argument, and they would tell me things like, well, maybe after a year, maybe after a year and a half. And the two jobs that I got to interview with the CEOs.
Hmm.
And so when they interviewed me, they wanted to hire me, and they had to say so. Matter of fact, the one for Home of New Vision, actually, Glynis Anderson actually told me, she said, "Do you know you're a miracle?" And that really makes you feel good, but it also makes you feel sad, because I shouldn't be the anomaly coming out of prison. I should be more of the norm.
Hmm.
It made me feel good that I overcame it, but it made me feel bad that there aren't more. And there are. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I'm the. There's a lot of people
Right.
that come out that do great things, but we are the extreme
But the
minority.
stigma is, if somebody comes out of prison, especially for like a crime like that, that they're just going to commit that again and end up back in prison.
Absolutely, and it's an unfounded stigma.
Hmm.
It's just like, because actually there are all kinds of statistics that, especially somebody who's done the amount of time that I do, shows that we don't recidivate at the same level. We
You're-
age out of some of this stuff.
You're institutionalized.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the whole world is institutionalized. That's the one thing that I found out is most people out here are institutionalized too. I used to joke, I half jokingly talked about my family and stuff like that they did a bit too. It wasn't just me. The only difference is that their yard was bigger. The fence kept me in and kept me from them, and the fence kept them out and kept them from me. So that was kind of the difference. Institutionalization, the institutions are just a microcosm of the world as a whole. But so many people are caught up in their own institutional ways of thinking, whether it's, the way they order their groceries now on Amazon and stuff
true.
like that. They don't know what to do if Amazon does not show up at their door.
I mean, just look at COVID when everything shut down. People were panicking. They started going and buying random crap because they thought they were going to not be able to buy it. So
Absolutely.
that's a good point.
Absolutely. And the only difference is that it's I don't want to say that this is entirely the case, but in a society that has started to evolve in some ways and says these things are not okay, the one area that it still seems okay to pile on is with those who are criminal justice impacted. Because it's okay to call us names and labels that you wouldn't get away with calling somebody racially, ethnically, anything else. We're constant, like, I'm an offender
Okay.
because I'm still on parole.
Okay.
I mean, and then I become an ex-offender when I get off parole. And it's like, I haven't robbed a bank in 29 years, like, when do I become unoffensive? But it's okay. And I think in some ways, unfortunately, society's been given a scapegoat that they still have a group of people. And the fact that the majority of people are black and brown in these situations is another way for some latent racism and stuff like that
Right.
to be able to come out, because they can just talk about convicts and offenders and everything else because they can't use the words that they actually want to use.
Right. Yeah. I had something I was going to say. I don't remember what it was now.
That happens.
So you obviously took courses in prison. What courses did you take, and what degree did you get?
I got a degree, an associate's degree, but it was in psychology.
Okay.
The university that I was working at didn't have one in sociology. So
Okay.
the majority of my credits, other than the stuff that I had to take, were either psychology, sociology, or philosophy, because I love philosophy too. The main class that I taught in there was a philosophy group called Wholeness Ethics. And it's based on a concept that a friend of mine, who's still in there after 37 years now, developed around the idea of right relationship and what are the three aspects of right relationship, which are reverence, goodwill, and justice. And it's about seeing there's something greater within everybody and speaking to that part of them, dealing with them on that level, being in right relationship even with wrong relators. And I think one of the most powerful parts of those three aspects is the last part, which is justice. And we redefine justice as giving what is needed to be whole as opposed to what is deserved for not being whole. And our justice system now is one of just desserts. And so whatever you did wrong, you need to be punished for it. And you can't somehow, be told you're a good person because you did something bad.
Right.
And I think that's destructive. It does not help people rehabilitate. And not only that, but the majority of us that have gone to prison are not very consequence minded. We don't really think about that. And a perfect example of that is the death penalty. Everywhere there's a death penalty, the amount of murders does not really change.
Really?
Because people aren't thinking about that when they're mad enough to kill somebody. People aren't thinking about that when they're broke enough that they need to
Right.
rob something or they're locked into a lifestyle. We're not thinking about the consequences. We're not thinking logically on that level. So
Now, coming out of prison, were you afraid that you might fall back into some of the things that you
No.
were involved in? You had completely transformed who you were as a person. You obviously matured and you studied a lot and became pretty self-aware of who you were.
I was not afraid of it. I was not concerned about it. I was afraid that somehow my past might catch up with me in some way, shape, or form, and somebody might put me under too much pressure. Not that I couldn't handle it, but that people lie. And when you're on parole and when you're under supervision, that's one of the biggest problems of the system that most people don't understand, especially that haven't been criminally justice impacted, is once they've got their hooks into you, then they keep their hooks into you. Like right now, I could go back for anything. I'm still a prisoner. I'm not a free person while you're on parole. This is the least restrictive form of incarceration, parole. So they would not have to prove anything.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, thankfully, I've got a rock star for a fiance, but if she got mad at me and said that I put my hands on her,
You'd be going back.
I would go back, and there would be no questions about it. And 2045 would be the only guaranteed out date
Really?
that I would have.
So they wouldn't treat it like a new crime.
No, because especially a lot of times, well, things have changed a little bit. It's hard to say with COVID. They're tinkering with their recidivism numbers by like holding people in jail longer and waiting till they're off parole and then sentence them for their new crime, because then it doesn't count against their recidivism rates. But that's another political ploy that's going on. But chances are they wouldn't bother with it because it's more judiciously efficient and more economical for them to just send you back with a sentence like this.
Right.
Because I hadn't learned my stuff all the way while I was in there either. I mean, several years ago, I was one of those people that was caught up in doing stupid tax stuff in there, and they came and they caught up with me and everything else, and they didn't prosecute because of the fact that I had so much time anyway.
Oh, wow.
They're like, it's not.
Knock it off.
Right. It's right. It's not going to work. So that's the one. The thing about it is that when you are on parole, you are still, subject to their rules, not all the legal rules and protections that a lot of people take for granted.
So do you have to meet with a parole officer every week or every couple days?
Monthly.
Every month, okay.
Monthly. I was when I first got out, I was under a more intensive version of it, and I had to give urine drops twice a month, and I had to see him twice a month. And COVID happened, and it kind of eased things up. And I've been, a model parolee anyway. I joke because a lot of times they don't always know what the resources are that are available. And I work as the Jackson Area Recovery Community Coordinator, so I'm aware of a lot of recovery resources and work with Nation Outside and stuff like that. So I've actually funneled some resources back to my local parole agents and stuff like that. So
that's one question I wanted to ask you is, now that you're out of prison, are you able to find a way to use your degree as far as like a job, or obviously you're working with other nonprofits?
Right. It's kind of secondary. The job that I've got two jobs. One of them is as a peer recovery coach. And I actually got trained for that shortly before I left prison. And we actually developed the program at St. Louis, which was the first one in a men's facility. And a peer recovery coach.
That's your water, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And a peer recovery coach is somebody who's had their own substance use issues and who has, traveled through different means to find recovery and can share their journey. It's a lived experience type of job. And so I became a certified peer recovery coach and a certified peer support specialist. One deals with mental health, one deals with SUD. And so those were the main things that helped me, find work. It's one of the few areas where my past comes into play and helps me. But a lot of places won't hire you too because I have too much lived experience. They're like, nah, we want some, but not quite that much. So it's worked. But my degree has also helped because I think it showed something of what I did with my time. It also, I mean, let's be honest. A degree is mostly for most jobs. It is a receipt to show that you have the ability to follow along with something and learn it to whatever degree. And so I showed that I was able to do that. I did a 3.83 or whatever.
Wow.
So I did okay as far as the grades go too. So
that's awesome.
yeah,
so
that logic class screwed up my 4.0.
was it difficult?
It was. Let me give you, in a nutshell, my last quiz before my final. I aced everything with informal logic. I love informal logic. When you get into the formal logic,
What's informal and informal and uninformal?
Well, the formal part is literally like math equations.
Okay.
It's like it's terrible. I didn't really like algebra, and I wasn't a big fan of English. And it was like the two of them had a bastard child and called it, formal logic. So it was very difficult. The informal logic is just basic things like lawyers and stuff learn. So they learn how to make different kinds of arguments, the law of division and multiplication, and advertising. You start to see it in everything around you, how they get you to think about things a certain way or make these faulty, arguments.
Right.
The formal, I did the last quiz before my final and got a 62 on it. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to figure this out. And I just nose to the grindstone, kept plugging it out, and all of a sudden something clicked. And my final had a 10-point extra credit question on it, so I ended up with 107% on my final.
Wow.
So it just clicked, and I don't know. That was a big turning point for me too. I'd already gotten on the path, but there was something about that was like, if I can do this and if I can do it kind of on my own, because when you're doing correspondence through the mail, by the time you get a response to a question you've already had to figure it out by 3 weeks to get on to the next thing.
Wow.
So
that's insane.
Yeah, it taught me, it helped me get that resilience that I said that I didn't have when I left the first time. So
I can't remember the guy. I want to look him up. So the guy that I had on from Good Time Makes Good Sense, he had said to me that prison, he didn't survive prison, because people oftentimes ask him, how did you survive prison? He'll respond, I didn't.
Right.
Because he went in at 16 years old and didn't get out until he was like almost 40.
Right.
Would you agree with that statement? Because he had said that prison broke him. It broke who he was as a person, and he's kind of forever broken from it.
I think the way I described it to my fiance is that it takes bites out of you, and sometimes you don't learn where those bites have been taken out of you until later. I think some people are broken. We're all forever changed, and some of us are forced to give birth to a better version of ourselves. So I think that, no matter the circumstances, we're all affected.
Rich Griffin, that's his name.
Okay, yeah.
You know who he is?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I think he's working in Grand Rapids with Nation Outside now or something like that too. And I've run into him. I've run into most of these guys that are doing this.
Yeah.
You can't do that amount of time and not run into each other, Rick Speck and Jose and
Jose Rivera?
Yes.
I invited him on the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of guys that I've run into over the years, and most of them started this path before they ever came home. Because you have to. One of the worst things that happens, and it happens out here too, but again, it's more obvious in there because you're under a microscope in some ways, is this when I get a better job, when I earn more money, when the kids grow up, all these things that somehow is later. In prison, it all revolves around one thing: when I get out. And I used to tell guys all the time in the classes, why aren't you doing the stuff that you can do now, though? You're going to have so much to do when you get home. Let's get these things checked off
Right.
before you walk out. So that's what I was doing with my degree. That's what I was doing with these habits and things like that. Everything that I could do while I was there, I did, so that when I walked out, literally, you put me on the ground and I took off running. My fiance still looks at me sometimes and she said, "No, you told me, but I didn't know what it would actually look like." And sometimes she still has to check to make sure that what I'm doing is self care because I'm so busy. Jerry asked me if I had any hobbies. This is my hobby and this is my life. You know, I, I, I got through prison and I grew in prison by every day I put my head down for the last 15 years. I knew I'd done my best and I'd accomplished something. There was a sense of purpose in every day. And that's what I do now too. It's not that I'm anti hobby. It's I don't have time for a hobby because I love what I do.
Trying to make up for time, lost time.
And I love what I do, and I think that's kind of what a hobby is an opportunity to do something that you love, and what I'm doing I love. Yep. So, why would I want to pick up a ball of yarn and some needles or something? I mean, I don't know if I'd love that.
Maybe not that hobby. That sounds real boring.
I did do latch hook as a kid, though, so.
So how did you meet your fiance? Did you guys meet while you were in prison? You said you guys been together for 13 years, right?
That's an interesting story, and because talk about stigma. There's stigma with prison wives and prison girlfriends and things like that too.
Right.
And she's not the typical in any way, shape, or form. Her cousin came to prison.
Okay.
And he was in his 40s, more effeminate. The things that you would always look for somebody coming into prison, that they're not good things. It is not going to be a good time for him in prison. And he'd struggled with a lot of stuff, and he had had a serious suicide attempt before he came to prison. And everybody in his family was in panic mode because he had like a 5-year sentence, and it's like there's no way he's going to survive this. So they were just waiting for the other shoe to drop and to hear that he'd passed away. And so everybody was rallying around him and circling the wagons and writing him on a regular basis. And time passed, and they just kept hearing, Taz said this, and Taz said that, and Taz talked about this in class. And after about a year had passed, everybody in the family had started to realize that Dan was not only doing okay and was going to survive, it seemed like he was thriving in some ways. He was growing in ways that they didn't anticipate. And Katie, being the person that she is, and being raised by her mother, who taught her to write thank you notes, wrote me a thank you note and telling me how much I had impacted the entire family, which is something I had never considered. I knew I was impacting the people that I was working with. I hadn't fully thought about the ripple effects of those kind of things. And so she told me how much of a difference I'd made in her life and the rest of her family's life. And it's funny because Dan tried to give me her address. I said, Dan, she wrote through you for a reason. She's not trying to write. But I did want to tell her, because I knew how much it had changed my life, to hear about that impact. I wanted her to know how much she'd impacted my life. And so I wrote her back, and she mulled it over for about a month and wrote me back. And we've been inseparable ever since. Thousands of pages of letters later.
Wow.
I wrote her a 57-page letter one time on a typewriter, and I set it to 15 pitch so that I could get 144 characters per line. So when I say it was 57 pages on a normal letter with normal spacing, that was like a 100-page letter.
Jeez.
So, yeah, set the bar high.
That's hilarious. Well, that's quite the interesting story, and it's cool that you were able to make such an impact in somebody else's life while you were on a whole family.
Sure.
Rather. But so looking back on your time in prison, are you happy that you served? Not necessarily happy, but are you glad that you were put into a situation to where you had to either correct yourself or essentially you're probably heading towards like death, you know.
Yes. Yes. Ultimately, I am. It's hard for people to understand that with serving 27 years because the first thing that they want to do is like grieve for you, and
Right.
I wanted to too at first, but
27 years is a long time.
it is a long time, and it's unimaginable when you're 22. You can't even picture that. It's beyond your understanding.
Hmm.
So there were, in the midst of doing it, I had more of those feelings than I do now. Uh, I guess the best way that I can sum it up is like people will ask me certain things and they'll ask like, "Do you have any regrets?" Or time that was lost. First off, the time wasn't lost. I have to dispel something, and that is prison is not the worst place in the world. There's still people there, and there's still good people there, and there are people that I love in there, and people that are friends of mine in there, and I had some good times in there. It's not a place to live, in your entire life, and it's very difficult. It's like, trying to grow flowers on a sidewalk. Every once in a while, you'll see one pop through, but it's not a good environment for it. But nonetheless, I lived my life in there, so I appreciate that. I also have to learn things the hard way. So I had fooled myself for so long that the only way that I was going to know that these things were real were to be put through challenges repeatedly and be like, okay, that is who you actually are. The last challenge I got in that regard was I got to my minimum out date with my disciplinary credits, but I was under the habitual, so I actually had to petition and go back before the judge, and it was a successor judge. And again, like I said, she didn't fully understand the way things were going, and they didn't even review what I'd done with my time. It was just like, you need to do this. So 25 years into this, with my whole family sitting in the gallery in Eaton County Courthouse, which was emotional because every other time I'd been in that courthouse, I'd just hurt people. And so I walked in there every time, and I would see the people I hurt, and I would see the other people I hurt, which were my family that were there to support me. And this
Right.
time I walked in there a whole different person, and I hadn't hurt anybody until I walked out of the courtroom because she shot me down. So now everybody who's there to support me is now crying in tears and thinking there's no way this just happened.
Right.
And so I had to take the long ride back to the facility I was at.
Where were you housed at?
At that point in time, I was at St. Louis. I've been to like 15 different facilities, some
Holy
of them
cow.
more than twice. The
All-
biggest
all
places,
in Michigan?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, all in Michigan. I did the brunt of my time. I did like 6 years at MR, and I did 9 years at Ken Ross. But I've been to quite a few different facilities, and so I go back to St. Louis, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do now? Because she just told me I've got to do 4.5 more years.
Right.
So now it's like a whole new bit. I just did it 25. Now I got to do 4. And it came to me that you'll keep doing what you've been doing. And I went back in and I taught a class because that's kind of who I am and that's what I do. And it's cathartic for me too. And there was no other option. I allowed myself to grieve. I allowed myself to get angry because it was messed up. That never should have happened. But that last 2 years taught me that everything that I'd done was real. And for the first time in my life, I absolutely knew who I was, knew what I was capable of. And I'm grateful for a couple guys that were working in the law library with me that said, no, don't lay down and take this. Because I thought about it and I was like, you're going to victimize your family all over again if you just accept these 4 years. And so I took it back on appeal and I won my appeal. I've got a published opinion, which is a rare thing for a lawyer to get, let alone somebody doing it from a prison law library. And that's what got me out before COVID.
What was published?
It's the entire. It's Adam Grant versus the state of Michigan. I don't have the numbers right now because they just actually came out with the numbers. So it would be something Mishap.
Can we look it up at some point?
Absolutely, absolutely. Matter of fact, I'll try and get it. My mother-in-law actually knows the site. She used to work for the Attorney General's office, so she knows the actual site. but it should change the way that some people are treated, because it said that you have to take into account new information. You can't. The whole point behind sending somebody to prison is rehabilitation. It's punishment too, but the punishment factor's taken care of. That's built
Right.
into it. But you can't make a decision about somebody who's been down for 25 years without looking at what he did with those 25 years.
So how long were you sent back to prison before you won your appeal?
2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
So does anything happen to them?
No.
Are you accounted for that time?
No.
No, it's just lost time.
No. Because again, you don't have any right to any outdate except for 2045.
Wow.
And so that's one of the things that I think, like, good time making good sense and doing things like this is hard for people to wrap their heads around, because they've got some things, they've got some lower hanging fruit that it's easier for them to do.
Right.
Like when you hear about people, wrongfully incarcerated in the first place, that's easy for the average person to be like, that's some bull, that should never happen.
Yep.
You even got, on the next layer of it, you've got juvenile lifers, where some people are like, yeah, you're right, that's not cool, we shouldn't be sending juveniles.
That was like Rich Griffin.
Exactly. So they can start to do that. I fall into the category where it's easier for people to take shots because they're like, you're guilty. Yes, I'm guilty. I'm as guilty as they come. I admit it.
Right.
But still, how do we treat even the guilty? It's
Right.
27 years, and like you said, most of us are coming out. And
Right.
who do you want coming out next to you?
Right.
It wasn't the Department of Corrections. It wasn't their programs that reformed me. It's the same things that got me in trouble, that got me to get my life together, because I got stubborn and I decided, you people aren't going to win. I'm not going to become the person that you want to be. I'm not going to become a statistic. I'm going to become the person that I was, created to be. And that's been a pretty amazing discovery.
Now, what was one of the most difficult things coming out of prison? I mean, because obviously when you went in, it was a different time. It was a different era. And then and then coming out, we now have smartphones and
Right.
laptops and whatnot. What was that like?
It actually started before I came home, because you don't get exposed to computers or anything like that in there either. So remember, the internet in earnest started the year after I went to prison.
Wow.
That's a little bit of context.
That marks a time in history.
Yes, there were like Commodore 64s and stuff when I was out. And so nobody really did anything with them. I didn't. And you don't get exposed to them in there, because the Department of Corrections they're not full Luddites. They're not completely scared of technology. They're afraid of what we'll do with technology. And so, like, we skipped the CD era. We went from cassette tapes to MP3s because they didn't even want to let CDs in the state of Michigan. So I got a job 2014 at Carson City as a clerk, and it was the first time I got to touch a computer.
Wow.
And I went and I'd seen stuff on TV and stuff like that, so I thought I knew what I was doing. So I clicked on it, and it shadowed, and I looked at it, and it didn't open. And I clicked it again, and it didn't open. And I was too proud to ask my coworker. It took me 5 minutes of clicking this thing one time and looking at it. And finally, I was like, dude, I keep clicking this thing. What seems to be the problem? And he's like, did you double click it? I'm like, what's a double click?
Where's that button at?
Right. So that technology part of it started early, but I was grateful for that job, because the next 2 jobs that I had access to a computer, and so I taught myself a lot of things. And then they did the Second Chance Pell Grants, and I got in that just before I left, so I was able to take a Microsoft Suite class and stuff
cool.
like that. So I learned that, and I've got a brother-in-law that's knows his stuff with a lot of things, so he's kept me out of some kind of trouble that it's easy to get into, and put things on your phone you shouldn't put on your phone, and things of that nature. So it's been interesting, but I haven't been resistant, but I've always been the same way. What I need to know, I learn, and what I don't, a lot of times I don't. So I'm slowly learning things. I don't know much about Instagram or Twitter or anything like that. I'm having a hard enough time doing the social media stuff for my job with the Facebook page. But eventually, I'd like to learn some of that stuff. So
That's cool. Now, we're going to wrap this up soon, but what is your future goals? I'm sure Jerry asked you what your future goals for the next 5 years are. What are some of your goals?
Actually, Jerry didn't get a chance to ask me that because we went long anyway, and I had to pick somebody up. So I don't know if I necessarily have 5-year goals. I have daily goals that lead me to greater things. I'm a
Okay.
directional type of person. Like I know that I'm heading north northwest, and so I worry about the roads and I pivot as I go. He did ask me, however, if that I want to kind of carve out and do something other than like criminal justice reform and prison reform, and the answer to that is no. I see myself in this field. I'll turn 63 when I get to the half and half point of half of my life in, half of my life out. So it doesn't make any sense for me to kind of move on and
How old are you right now?
51.
Wow.
51. So
Well, you look good.
Why,
51.
Thank you very much. They say that prison will sometimes pickle you in one way, shape, or form. So it seems to have preserved me a little bit. But I want to see myself in this field, and how that ends up transforming. I joked on Jerry's show too that Ashley for Nation Outside got my job because I interviewed for the job too. She's an awesome fit, and she's better for it than I am. I'll give her credit for that. When she moves on at some point in time, I think I'll still be around. But I want to work in this. I want to work in this field because I think it's extremely important, and I think it's the basic idea of no decisions about us without us.
Mm-hmm.
We know what's going on. We may not always know what will work, but I'll tell you what, I know what won't work a lot better than somebody who's studied theory.
Right.
You know, because
Yeah.
I've seen it, and I'm not saying everything that works for me will work for somebody else, but I can tell you a lot of things that won't work. So I want to be involved in this. I want to continue to be an advocate. I show up for things like this on a regular basis because I've been told that I have a really simple way of putting things simply so people can understand them.
Yep.
And that's what I think is needed because more people need to be pulled into the tent because so often everything that we're talking about I see the same people at
Right.
all the time.
Right.
And it's good to be able to talk to preach to the choir because the choir needs preaching to too, but you also got to open the windows and expand the congregation.
Right.
And that's what I kind of want to do, and that's what I see myself doing is kind of being a face. I joke that I've got suits at home I hardly ever get to wear because of COVID, but it's my camouflage because it gets me into doors that wouldn't otherwise, and then once they let me in, then I can tell them my story because they think they know something about me looking at me.
Have you had, because that was one thing Rich talked about, he was saying that he would meet with like legislators and stuff, and he would propose the good time makes good sense argument to them, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and then he would tell them his story. Oh, I was in prison for 24 years or whatever, and they're like, oh, well, I'm not so interested anymore.
Right, right, and that does happen. It also happens that there have been a lot of times over the years that the main advocates that we've had and the most staunch advocates we've had have been people who've been in relationships with people in prison, and so if somebody wants a reason to turn up their nose, they will.
Wasn't that credible?
Yeah. So they find an excuse to, and that's all they're waiting for anyway. And it's like if you expect Captain Kangaroo to come make an argument for us with Mr. Green Jeans, then you're in for something else. We're going to make the argument. And to me, if you want to turn up your nose at somebody like Rich, then you're not paying attention because you can take credit for him.
Right.
If you want to say that you've done anything right in the system, you should be elevating our voice.
Right.
It proves to me that that's not necessarily what they want, and it certainly isn't what they believe in, or else they would be finding ways to engage us and claiming us as success stories. Instead, they sit there and shoot at us in certain ways. And somebody told me one time, nobody shoots at burnout light bulbs. So as long as people are taking shots at me, I must be emitting some kind of light. I feel good with that.
Well said. I couldn't have said it better. I think it's important for people like you who have experienced prison to speak up and be advocates for criminal justice. So I think it's great, and I commend you for doing it.
Well, I hope it's good because with all that other time, this is the best purpose that I can think of for it. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't get a job at Shell because they wouldn't let me order 50. They wouldn't let me handle $50 or more, which is
Wow.
kind of ridiculous. I couldn't get the apartment above my mother-in-law because I had a criminal history, despite the fact that we had already been approved with my fiance. All these different things that I can't do. The one thing that I know that I can do is speak to my experience and tell people this is possible. The one thing that I would like to extend in this realm and extend the canopy to include is not just returned citizens, but the citizens that are still sitting inside the walls, because they keep seeing the people who are coming back
Right.
and who have done something wrong, and they hear these faint stories occasionally of a few of us. They need to know how many of us are out here fighting for them and that they have a responsibility in this too. So they need to start doing the work now so that there's more of us out here.
Right.
You know, there's plenty of room in this arena for more of us. And the more of us we have, the more the system is going to have to change because they'll run out of people.
And that's how you break the stigma.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you want to talk about while you're on here? Do you want to promote some of the, what was that one nonprofit that you work for?
I work for Home of New Vision, and they do remarkable work when it comes to recovery and stuff like that. And so I'm grateful for them, and they definitely hire returning citizens, which is a good place too. But the two main things that I just want to promote right now is Nation Outside.
Nation Outside, that's what it
Nation Outside is amazing. It is those who've been justice impacted, those are the formerly incarcerated, trying to be the voice for the voiceless, which are the people who are still inside, and some people who are out who still don't have a voice. They're finding their way into legislative sessions. They're finding their way into boardrooms. They're finding their way into government positions and things like that.
Quick question.
Yes.
So do all these groups, do they work together? Like for something like this, I would think that Good Time Makes Good Sense would want to work with like Nation Outside.
Right. And they do.
Do they?
And they do. There's been a few events that I've been to that literally, I think her name's Mariah. She works with them too, and she'll sit down at the actual tent that we have set up, and we'll do that at different places. So they'll have something set up, and we'll sit with them. I'm sitting with the Jackson District Library for Nation Outside down in Jackson on the 28th. There's a lot of places who do work together. There's also a lot of people who will cannibalize one another because they see it as a zero-sum game, and they're more important. It's more important sometimes for them to maintain their status and their agency than what it is we're trying to work for. One of the reasons I like working with Nation Outside is because that's not their thing. They're not necessarily trying to hog all the oxygen in the room.
Right.
They're not trying to take all the money. They are a non-service organization, so they don't do direct services, which frees them up to be able to help some other agencies and stuff like that. And another one that I'd like to give a shout out to is KT Kelly and Power and Passion, because what she's doing has the ability to do exactly what we're talking about, that you create, there's a technological format that all of a sudden you can put everybody together and everybody can be found easily. People come out of prison all the time and they've got the same tired documents from the 1980s. I'm not exaggerating. It's a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, and you can barely read it.
Wow.
And they're so antiquated, and they tell you about these things you can get that you can't get anymore. To do something technologically and to be able to put that information back into people's hands, so when they come out, no matter where they're at, all of a sudden they can pull up this Power and Passion app and find who is return citizen friendly when it comes to housing, when it comes to, there's mental health services that she's putting on there, people, employers that are promoting returned citizens' rights and their value and things like that. All these things that she's doing to me are amazing. It's still in its infancy, and I'm kind of trying to give the big shout out, because the other thing that we have to think about this is a small area, and anytime we have to work in other fields, that's something that's being brought. I'm working 60 hours at other jobs and volunteering to do this.
Right.
But anytime that we can find ways to support things like this. We need to do it, and we need to put a shoulder behind this stuff because she's got kids. She doesn't need to be working another job. She needs to be making this
Right.
everything that it can possibly be.
Could you put me in contact with her?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Yeah, that's not even an issue I was aware of.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you brought that to my attention.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I think in an ideal world we would all be working together.
Yeah.
But I think unfortunately anytime you have people, there are politics.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the people don't even know they're practicing the politics.
Right.
But that's also why I think some of us coming out of prison are so built for this stuff, because the yard is nothing but politics. And so you learn how to navigate a bunch of people. Out here, you can get away from everybody.
Right.
In there, you got 1,600 people, and I see the same 1,599 people every day going into the chow hall, going into the library, things like that. I have to navigate. I have to pay attention to other people.
Right.
You know, some people are a little bit more versed at it, but all of us that have been there have figured out how to read a yard. And like I said, this is just a bigger yard. So.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate this. You're an awesome person.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed talking with you. And your story is incredible. I'm glad that you were able to come out on the other side and that you weren't the stereotype.
Me too. Me too.
All right. Well, thanks again.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.